Hello to all, and thank you for joining us this evening for the third event in our exciting speaker series, Take 3, IU-Bavarian Talks, co-hosted through a collaborative effort between Indiana University and Bavarian American Academy. In this virtual speaker series, we are delighted to bring together leading scholars from Indiana University and Bavarian institutions to discuss many of the major themes defining this current era in our transatlantic world and beyond. My name is Eric Lehmann, and I'm a board member of the Bavarian American Academy, in addition to holding the chair of management and organization at the University of Augsburg in southwestern Bavaria. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you all, not only as a Bavarian academic and board member of the BAA, but also as a Hoosier, having completed a research stay at Indiana University in Bloomington prior to becoming a full professor in Germany, and also having been appointed as an adjunct professor at Indiana University in 2015. Before we start, I'd like to say a few quick words about the BAA. The BAA, as some of you know, provides a platform for research and exchange among scholars dedicated to the study of American society and culture. Our members specialize in fields as wide-ranging as history, geography, literature, media and the arts, religion and politics, and even business and economics. And often these fields are intertwined. Our program includes conferences, workshops, a summer school, film screenings, and many other events. Do check out our program on our new website. As we all know, events and initiatives like this speaker series do not just happen. They require dedication, careful collaboration, and flexibility through partnership, and key people within those partnerships. In this vein, I would like to explicitly thank Dr. Margareta Schweiger-Wilhelm, Managing Director of the Bavarian American Academy, and Andrea Adam-Moore, Director of the IU Europe Gateway in Berlin, who, along with a wonderful staff, have put in so much effort to make tonight and the speaker series as a whole reality. Today, Christoph Irmscher, Kirsten Trellebeck, and David Pauly will discuss how the humanities and social sciences can contribute their expertise, shift the public discourse to make it more permeable for nuances, and help disentangle the seemingly chaotic web of conspiracy narratives, political distrust, and anti-elitism that has infected contemporary society. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to introduce David Pauly, an outstanding colleague with trailblazing publications in science or nature, among others. And an honor for me personally, since I'm addicted to paleontology and what we can learn from this discipline and apply to other fields of interest, even in business and economics. David Pauly is professor in Indiana University's Earth and Atmospheric Science Department, where he serves as department chair, and he has also appointments in biology and anthropology. He's a paleontologist who studies and teaches about evolution, the history of the Earth, and long-term causes and consequences of climate change. He's also involved in public land policy relating to paleontology and conservation. He earned his PhD in paleontology at the University of California, Berkeley, and was a fellow at the Michigan Society of Fellows in the Geological Sciences. David Pauly is also the head of the PolyLab at Indiana University, a highly respected and successful research laboratory with a focus on the challenge to understand how species respond to environmental change. As you can see, we have the perfect speakers for tonight's topic. Kirsten, Christoph, and David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eric. As Eric mentioned, I am a paleontologist, a professor at Indiana University. And as a paleontologist, I am, of course, a scientist. And I'm a scientist whose work intersects with several lines of contested scientific narrative. I work on the process of evolution, and creationism and anti-evolution have had a long history in North America and in Europe. I also work on the responses of vertebrates of the past to changes of climate in the past and also in the present, which also intersects with contemporary climate change denial narratives. The narratives of science denial, alternative facts, and fake news extend well beyond the sciences. And in fact, in many ways, as a scientist, I'm somewhat isolated from those narratives because they often sidestep me or exclude me in some way or the other. So I'm here tonight with two professors from the humanities, Dr. Kirsten Twelbeck and Dr. Christoph Irmscher, to talk about some of these themes from the perspective of the humanities and some of the broader societal trends and patterns that we see in them. Kirsten Twelbeck studied American Studies and Theater and Drama in Erlangen, Berlin, and Bloomington at Indiana University. She received her PhD from Freie Universität in Berlin, focusing on self-representations of Korean Americans. She then worked as an assistant professor at the Universität Hanover, where she finished her habilitation about the Reconstruction era, and she has since held visiting professorships at various German universities and now works at the Environmental Science Center at the Universität Augsburg. She's the coordinator of an international doctorate program and conducts an interdisciplinary research project on wheat. Professor Irmscher is a distinguished professor here at Indiana University in the Department of English. He's the director of the Wells Scholars Program, which is an undergraduate program for talented students. Among his books are The Poetics of Natural History, which is now in its second edition, and he co-edits the weekly news bulletin of the Concerned Scientist at Indiana University. So I'd like to welcome them and give each one of them a chance to introduce themselves a little bit and their thoughts on this very important topic. Kirsten, shall we start with you?
Thank you very much, David, for this kind introduction. I've thought quite a bit about how to best prepare for tonight's session, and I ended up thinking that it might be best if I start by describing my work context as it is right now, because I think it explains my perspective as a humanities scholar on science denial. I then want to focus on one aspect of science denial, and that is the scientists themselves, because I'm a literary studies scholar by training, and therefore I focus on narrative, as you just also mentioned, and of course on narrative traditions, on narrative figures, and so on. And the scientist, of course, is such a figure. And I'll end with discussing a little bit the concept of science skepticism and how that concept is used by science denialists. So I'd like to start with a confession, and that is that I feel incredibly privileged. Privileged because unlike most of my colleagues in the humanities, I actually work in a, as you could call it, a radically interdisciplinary research environment. As you said, I'm a cultural studies scholar, an American studies scholar, but I work in an environmental studies center, the Wissenschaftszentrum Umwelt WZU at Augsburg University. And this is quite an interesting center for me but it is located next to the physics building. And actually many of our members come from the natural sciences. So the WZU for me is the perfect environment to cooperate with disciplines outside of the humanities. And that is really very rare, including the human geography, health sciences, resource studies, but also other fields. We organize workshops together, we publish together, but we also just chat and talk over a cup of coffee. So I have this kind of personal network as well. This personal exchange has been incredibly helpful for my own research, which is on wheat, as you said, but also for my job as a coordinator of the environmental humanities. This is what I was originally hired for. I was meant to establish the environmental humanities. at a central research focus at our center. So in October this year, I became the coordinator then for a new and interdisciplinary program, doctorate program called Rethinking Environment, which is also cooperation between the University of Augsburg and the LMU, the Ludwig-Maximilian University in Munich. And I'm also one of the 20 advisors in this program. The research topic are the profound ecological transformation processes that shape our past, present, and future. So we have 20 PhD students. They come from various disciplines in the humanities and social sciences. They analyze the social, cultural, and historical dimensions of ecological transformation processes. And they do so explicitly as part of a network that encourages cooperation with other partners in the natural sciences as well. And this is why, you know, this center is so ideal. Their projects cover a broad spectrum of topics. So one of our PhD students works on poems about glaciers. Another one looks at the connotations of artificial food. Another one investigates the impact of agricultural subsidies in rural communities in a valley in Pakistan. Another one looks at drill core samples and analyzes how they shape our relationship to the underground, and so on. So none of these topics actually can do without knowledge from the natural sciences. This means that numbers and statistics do matter for many of these projects, but the focus is not on empirical research, but it's rather on shedding light on neglected dimensions of environmental transformation and on asking new questions. And that brings me to the first point I wish to make with regard to science denial, because I believe that interdisciplinary approaches can help us move beyond the dichotomies that dominate contemporary debates about evolution, climate change, or COVID-19. So if we want to change this cultural climate, where the scientific consensus is under attack, we, I think, must build lasting cooperations across inter and transdisciplinary lines. So I do not believe that the humanities can do away with conspiracy theories and other strategies that are used to delegitimize, delegitimize sorry, science. But I do think that we can help and deconstruct the narratives that do so. So this is our expertise as literary studies scholars, philosophers, historians, ethnographers, and so on. And that brings me to my second point. And that point is about the scientist as a figure in anti-scientific discourse. So I'm actually talking about people like you, David, but also about people who work in the humanities. One of the most effective strategies of delegitimizing researchers is declaring them mad scientists. That goes for you, David, I guess, or bookworms. That goes for people like me. Demonizing the natural scientist and ridiculing the philosopher separates them rhetorically from each other, but also from society. Their place is in the proverbial ivory tower, a 19th century colonial metaphor, by the way, if you think of the ivory, that describes those who make their living at a comfortable distance from society. The skepticism vis-a-vis those at the top who know nothing about the real lives of the people reverberates in today's discourse of science denial. And I think it's very much in the foreground of that discourse. Science denialism not only delegitimizes what it calls mainstream science, but it goes against the scientists themselves. Experts on climate change, virology, genetics are cast as researchers, sociopaths, if not psychopaths, and also as criminals. And I prepared, you can just Google that and then you see a lot of this stuff. So this is, arrest Fauci and Gates, for example. I want to remind you that actually one of the stock figures of science denial is the money-grabbing scientist who is actually a modern day Rumpelstiltskin, who does it all for the money. And maybe you are familiar with this Grimmsche tale of the Rumpelstiltskin, which actually features this, this figure that's marked as Jewish, as someone who turns straw into gold. So like the Rumpelstiltskin tale itself, the mad scientist narratives brim with anti-Semitism. And I can also illustrate that by showing you, this here. This is our German star virologist, Christian Drosten. And you see this here, this caricature on the right side, which is clearly anti-Semitic. What you also see here on the left side, trust me, I'm a doctor, is Drosten juxtaposed with, together with Mengele, the well-known KZ concentration camp doctor. So what is then particularly disturbing for me are also COVID deniers who identify with the victims of the Nazis. They stage their distrust of those on top by wearing Nazi-era yellow stars that read unvaccinated, ungeimpft, nicht geimpft. So obviously then COVID protests are used to redefine one's individual and collective relationship to the Holocaust in Germany. So, I know that these discourses also exist in the United States, but they have a different function, I would say, in the German context. So science denialism relies on age-old stereotypes, on decontextualization, false numbers, and unauthorized experts. It scandalizes science and aims to inspire moral outrage. It therefore ignores the control mechanisms that are an intrinsic part of how we actually do science today. Science denial goes along with representations of research institutions as utterly unethical twilight zones that are under the control of powerful political and economic elites. So I've described the mad scientists in the ivory tower narrative to hint at how the humanities and social sciences can add new perspectives to the public discourse about science and inspire that discourse with additional questions and knowledge systems to inspire, add, broaden, dissolve, contribute. These verbs go against the dichotomies that structure science denial. Often, the way we use language and narrative prevents us from finding solution to contemporary challenges like climate change. I would also add that I think that modern humanities actually has a hard time living with the uncertainties that that go along with with some narratives that are open-ended, for example, that are not as dichotomous, that don't have these hero figures, that, good and bad kind of structure. I think that we actually want to get rid of the many ambiguities that structure our lives and relationships in real life. From a literary studies viewpoint, both the uncritical belief in science and the denial of science are logical consequences of this yearning for closure, for grand narratives that offer salvation. Some of these grand narratives are religious ones. I'm thinking of apocalyptic tales, for example, about the turn of the millennial, but also of the quasi-religious approach to science that assigns a priest-like role to the scientists. After all, Christian Drosten and Anthony Fauci have become secular savior figures for some, while others see them as demons. Let me move from the mad and Christ-like scientists to the more sophisticated rhetoric of science denial. Actually, science denial is mostly science skepticism. Two of my colleagues here in Augsburg, the philosopher Jens Söntgen and the the communication scientist Helena Bilancic, they have pointed out that skepticism is a central virtue in academic research, including the empirical sciences themselves. Self-reflection and a willingness to correct previous errors are part of the scientific code of conduct. In other words, the science denialists who now call themselves climate skeptics, for example, or science skeptics, they appropriate a strategy of academic self-legitimization and authorization for their own aims. Those self-declared climate and science skeptics redefine the skeptical ethos of empirical science whenever the so-called established scientists disagree with each other, whenever they adapt previous extrapolations to current developments, they are identified by these people as incapable waverers, if not unethical liars. It falls onto the philosopher to explain why this rhetoric is deeply flawed. As Söntgen actually reminds us, climate skeptics share nothing with their Greek role models. Unlike the skeptic from antiquity, self-proclaimed climate skeptics do not cultivate a detached attitude. Instead of subordinating their personal opinions for the sake of cool-hearted objectivity, these self-proclaimed skeptics are actually dogmatics. Söntgen even identifies them as dissenting dogmatics, that is, heretics. Unlike legitimate climate skeptics, who also exist, who comply with the fundamental rules of science research, these self-proclaimed skeptics accuse the so-called scientific establishment of having shed the scientific ethos of self-doubt and self-reflection for personal glory and financial gain. And then we come back to this figure of the mad scientists and so on. So I'm coming to the end now. This is not a war that natural scientists can win, I think, without the help of the humanities. As a literary and cultural studies scholar, I'm worried, but also fascinated, I must say, by the enormous gap in how people interpret the world. No matter if one follows the science or believes in alternative facts, it seems pretty obvious to me as a professional reader of societies in transition that we all yearn for these stories that offer us both orientation and consolation. If I was a PR specialist or a politician and not a literary and cultural studies scholar, I would perhaps be tempted to join those who now write consoling stories about how to stop climate change, how to get rid of the virus, how to deal with the pitfalls of digitalization and so on. But I am a humanities scholar and I shy away from such narratives. I find them to be overly simplistic, utterly unrealistic, locked up in customary patterns of thought. Both conspiracy narratives and tales of geoengineering refuse to shed light on a problem from various viewpoints. While I'm convinced that technological innovation is a necessary part of the solution, I also believe that it will not save us in the end, unless we manage to face the uncertainties and contradictions that are rarely addressed in such narratives. Unless we become more tolerant of ambiguities and contradictions and more willing to question our views of fundamental concepts, such as progress or nature. So, of course, I cannot speak for all of us, of course, but for me, my training as a literary studies scholar helps me cope, and that's more like a psychological effect, maybe. My training as a literary studies scholar helps me cope with the many challenges of our time. Reading and analyzing realist novels, for example, has taught me to accept that there are many views of one story, that they sometimes contradict each other, that they cannot always be integrated. It was while studying poetry and experimental fiction that I discovered as a student that there is actually joy in not knowing, in ambiguity, in openness, in multiple meanings, and in multiple outcomes. Literary studies have actually made me more tolerant of failure. I believe that the humanities and social sciences can help prevent societies from falling apart along ideological lines. These fields of knowledge production can inspire societies how to read the world, how to distinguish scientific arguments from pseudoscientific ones, how to combine skeptical detachment with empathy and passion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the interesting ideas, which we will return to in this conversation. Now I'd like to give Christoph Irmscher a chance to say a little about himself and to give some introductory thoughts about the topic.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David, and thank you for having me as part of this event. As David has already mentioned, I am a literary scholar as well, but I also direct the Wells Scholars on this campus. And in that capacity, I do have a lot of opportunities for interdisciplinary work, interdisciplinary teaching. My own academic work has been at the intersection of literature and the history of science. And I've been lucky enough to teach classes in collaboration with scientists on this campus, the seismologist Michael Hamburger at Indiana University, and I, for instance, have taught a class on natural disasters a couple of times. And my remarks today come from essentially wanting to focus a little bit on that, on the results that have come from this kind of teaching. And I'd like to begin, as I often do, with Rachel Carson. My classes I often begin with Rachel Carson as well. It's a little section from the first chapter of Silent Spring towards the end. And as you can see in the slide, she refers to her time, and we are talking 1962, as an area of specialists, each of whom sees his own problem, is unaware of or intolerant of the larger frame into which it fits. And she also says it's an area dominated by industry, in which the right to make a dollar at whatever cost is seldom challenged. She wants an end to false assurances, to the sugarcoating of facts. So that's 1962. Fast forward to 2012, 50 years later, and you got what is the standard book really on science denialism, Nancy Oreskes and Eric M. Conway's The Merchants of Doubt, which was also made into a documentary, which you see on the right-hand side. And Conway and Oreskes also see the problem or the source of our problematic relationship with science in a breakdown of trust, a lack of trust. But for them, it's not the scientists who are at fault, but the merchants of doubt, as the title says. The merchants of doubt are those who have peddled misinformation about science to the public, sometimes for decades, on behalf of the corporations. Some of these are scientists as well, as they detail in the book. We know that, for instance, that the tobacco industry for 5 decades withheld information on the cancer risks associated with smoking, creating a perfect model for the fossil industry to cast doubt on scientific analyses of climate change, which is ongoing. There's certainly hope to some extent, especially when you think of the tobacco industry, which has to some extent lost its fight. And reassuringly, some polls do show that 7 out of 10 Americans do believe that the climate is changing. But then Donald Trump happened. Within days, references to climate change were scrubbed from government websites. And within a year, government scientists reported harassment and other interferences. This is from the Union of Concerned Scientists, and you see the various challenges that scientists list just within a year, ranging from censorship and self-censorship to dwindling resources. By the end of Trump's term, 3,000 scientists, an estimated 3,000 scientists, had left the government. The merchants of doubt had found their biggest ally right at the top. The results are visible today. nearly 8 in 10 Americans believe or are unsure about at least one common false statement about COVID or vaccines. And as you can see, there are such gems as the COVID-19 vaccines contain a microchip, or that they can change your DNA. Science denialism is not a new thing, however, and it's not new to find scientists among the perpetrators. I'm a historian of American science, as I mentioned, and one of my books is about Louis Agassi, the Swiss-American scientist who in the 1850s essentially created American science as we know it today in many ways, creating a graduate school, establishing a research museum, and all those things. Agassi, as I describe in this book, used his clout, and it was significant clout he had, and the language of science to cast doubt on science, to shut down scientific debate. In his case, it was evolution, and he had considerable power that he could put behind that goal. Today's scientists, too, have learned to evoke science, to cast doubt on science. I want to suggest just briefly here that science denialism has long ceased about the facts and therefore become even more effective. Even if the science denialists have lost some battles, as in the case of the tobacco industry, they still are, I believe, winning the war. For several decades now, they've instilled a parody of science in the minds of the public. Scientific truth, they suggest, means 100% consensus. Facts that have been firmly established for all time. And until there's consensus, everything is inquiry and open debate. And if nothing is settled yet, why do we have to act? And thus we see science denialists affecting the language of scientific questioning as if they really meant it. Even Trump knows the rules of this game. And this is from this infamous press conference in which he suggested experimentally sunlight as a way to kill the virus. And look at how in a statement he's using the words testing. Sounds interesting. The whole concept. So all of this is part of this kind of language game, the framing that I'm interested in. At a more elevated level, Stephen Koonin, it's a very recent book, Unsettled, ? Who's himself a physicist, a trained physicist, has suggested that there's no consensus yet. Here's an excerpt from his book, that until the climate's response to human influences is better determined, or failing that, until a values consensus emerges, until then, no need to do anything. It's better to wait. And you see on the right-hand side from the blog by my Indiana colleagues, Tim Londigan and Steve Victor, Debunking Science Denial, you see their refutation, and you don't need to read the entire thing. I've highlighted the essential phrase from it. Whatever you can say about climate data, and Koonin kind of tries to disaggregate them to create the impression that they don't tell a coherent story. They say they do provide a preponderance of evidence, not a perfect consensus, a preponderance of evidence supporting serious human influence. That is all we need, not to settle anything for good, but to reach a point at which action is warranted. Delay is something we cannot afford. As depressing as the story is, I would suggest that there is some hope, and that's why the humanities come in to some extent. If science denialism is not about the facts, but about the framing of the facts, and this coincides with what Carson has described as the skepticism that is being affected by the denialists, as long as it's not about facts, but about the way facts are being framed, about the way some folks might simulate openness with the intention of closing down debate, there's an opportunity for us as humanists to intervene, because we are people trained to look at the ways in which language is used for certain purposes. And there will be, I would suggest, a lot of work for us, since science denialism might very well be the only thing used by its proponents that is fully and infinitely recyclable. Thank you.
Thank you both for the very interesting thoughts. I'd like to start our conversation by picking up on this last theme of, skepticism is a part of science, and even textbook narratives of the scientific method involve skepticism, where one is supposed to remove yourself from the problem, lay it out in terms of competing hypotheses, apply data to it, and perhaps accept those results, but continue to probe them. And in fact, one of my colleagues is here in my department is fond of saying, anytime you read in a textbook the words "as is well known," there is a research project. And in my opinion, one of the things that is important about this kind of internalized skepticism is the social form it takes, if you will, among scientists. And I think this is something that extends into most scholarship, that we don't just simply say we don't think that's true. We don't just simply trot out a fact. We write a considered narrative. We publish papers. We feel obliged to read the papers of others and consider the ideas and the evidence that are in them. And indeed, part of becoming qualified as a PhD is to know the literature and the background of that field, so that you know the range of things that people have argued and the basis for them, and try to find your own way. And that, I'm sure, extends well into the social sciences, but even into, say, literary scholarship, or if one is for example, presenting a new reading of a text. There's a lot of scholarship that goes into that. The arguments are laid out, the reading is laid out so that others can revisit it. And it's easy to find examples from my own colleagues, who I have no compunction at all about calling scientists, who do habitually doubt. I do not always agree with them. And often they are in a minority opinion, but they're part of that discourse. What are your thoughts about how the larger public discourse fits into that? You mentioned Mr. Trump, the Rumpelstiltskin figure was mentioned, etc. Rachel Carson was mentioned, or the scientists who are working not at a university and pursuing pure research, but working for a corporation where they're performing a certain role. Do you have any thoughts about how those discourses fit into a discourse of scholarship, and whether there's a distinction between them?
I could perhaps, and there were several things in your statement. So you're asking, in a sense, about how the larger public fits into these kinds of narratives, and how perhaps the way I would interpret your question, denialists play on the public. There's just a very recent controversy, which also fits in with something that Carson has said. If you follow the news, sort of one figure that usually gets pilloried is Anthony Fauci, who emerges as sort of the whipping boy for many of these kinds of things. And it was just in the last 2 days was a really interesting exchange interesting comment by Fauci's nemesis, Rand Paul, who often spars with him publicly. And Fauci made a statement that was perfectly coherent and reasonable in context. He essentially explained the kind of animus that's directed against him as the need of as coming from the need of the public to identify science with a scientist, to put a face on something that is nameless. And he said, I get it. I represent science. What happened was that in the controversy, this last sentence, I represent science, was taken out of context by Rand Paul and used as an example of Fauci's arrogance, which was projected into another narrative that I see happening very frequently, which identifies these renegade scientists who don't represent science as it ought to be. That's the implication, to identify them with the medieval church. The same type of arrogance. Kunin, in a recent op-ed by Mitch Daniels, president of Purdue, was identified as the new Galileo, a science denier who is Galileo, who opposes scientific orthodoxy. So the suggestion in this narrative is that science in its public representatives right now has gone off the rails in a way. And that it's up to sane people like Rand Paul, who is a doctor, which helps in this particular situation, to say, we got to rein them back in. We got to curb these ideological excesses. We got to curb arrogance and all these things. These are people who have no skepticism, right? Fauci doesn't show self-irony when he makes statements like that. Of course, in context, the statement means something very different. It means for them, for the guys who attack me, I represent science. They take me as a convenient target because science as a complex is so fuzzy that I can't really negotiate with it. So that's a very clever way of manipulating it. Of course, Rand Paul knows exactly what that statement was supposed to mean. But when this trickles down into the kind of journalistic representation of it, that gets totally obliterated. And to me, this is also a situation where journalists are not doing the work that they ought to be doing. We are caught in a situation where journalists, in their effort to represent both sides, really abdicate their responsibility to some extent. It was an absolute misrepresentation of a statement, and it should be identified as such in the reporting about it, but they don't do it. And that's something that we need to think about. And humanities might be able to play a role in that too, in order to connect scientists, reluctant to often speak for themselves, with people who actually have the public's ear, in this case, the journalists.
Yeah, if I may add to that, talking about Fauci, when I did some research for this panel here, I found out about this documentary about Fauci that's actually also titled Fauci. And it's interesting that in that film, he actually is represented as a human being. And I mean, this sounds like, natural, but he is not the expert in here. It's actually very much about his work in the AIDS crisis and how he has emotionally suffered, during this time, how he is as a person. So you have his daughter or niece or so, talk about how, has a sense of humor and all of these things. So they are trying to get away from this kind of expert image that he has. And I think, this, that's what I meant when I talked about this mad scientist figure. The expert is also a figure, this expert who works for the government, who actually takes the political responsibility, or who is assigned political responsibility also by politicians who don't want to take that responsibility, I would say. That is a problematic position also for scientists. And I just found it quite interesting to look at the genre of the documentary film and how that is used in order to kind of rehumanize the expert. On the other hand, the precisely same genre is used in order to for further science denial. And I'm thinking of this pseudo documentary Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed by Ben Stein, that is actually about intelligent design and uses many of the methods that you just described, Christoph. And so talk as a literary and cultural studies person who's interested in genre, I find it quite interesting how this particular genre that has a close connection to facts and that works or functions according to this contract with the viewer who believes what it says because it's factual, how this is abused actually and used for all kinds of purposes.
If I can add something to that, I just finished reading this book. It's brand new, and Science Denial by Gail Sinatra and Barbara Hofer. why it happens and what to do about it. And they make a very interesting suggestion precisely to think about, how can we educate the public? And for me, one of the sort of really interesting points they make is that perhaps this needs to start in the schools. And perhaps we need to think the way we do science education. Not just, going back to a point I was trying to make, not just think about the facts, but convey a knowledge about how science works, that science actually evolves. When we think about Fauci, one of the most frequent complaints about him was that he was often wrong, which completely sort of ignores the fact that as the pandemic evolved, our knowledge of the pandemic was evolving, science is evolving. New facts were being added, and to instill that kind of understanding in children as they are in the classroom seems to be a very promising way of maybe preventing the kinds of things from happening that we see unfolding right now. And this is something where we as humanists have a responsibility too, because we teach future teachers. We have teachers in the classroom who will go into the schools and be responsible for conveying these things, not just science teachers. This is something that humanities teachers can also do, or social science teachers, for example. And that's something that we should remind ourselves in terms of the responsibility we have towards the students we are teaching.
And again, if I may add, I think it's not only about teaching, it's also about involving or getting people involved in science. Citizen science is an example for that. To get away from this ivory tower kind of idea and to get people involved in these processes of knowledge acquisition and, and how this transforms over time. One other point that always strikes me in our debates about science denial is the term narrative. I have the feeling that narrative is often mistaken as fiction, and as something that is basically maybe an opinion, that everything is narrative. It's kind of a gross misunderstanding maybe of postmodernism, relativism. And it actually shows me a lack of education about narrative strategies, about what narrative is and what types of narrative there are. And it sometimes makes me a little bit angry, like when I watch these panels on television, on German television. There are lots of panels about COVID and climate change and so on. And it's usually only natural scientists who are represented there, sometimes some social scientists, but never people from the humanities. And I think we need people also in public who can explain why opinion is not, is a different type of narrative than a scientific narrative, or why, and I can, also different example, an autobiography is a narrative, but it is very different from a novel. An autobiography has a different contract with the reader. We expect it to be truthful, and that is important. We expect that also from a scientist. There is an ethos behind that. This is not a fantasy story that people tell, who are scientists. If they do, they're not scientists anymore. And to sensitize people for, what types of narratives there are will also enable people to distinguish the types of narrative that are posted on the internet, because the internet is this huge narrative machine now. And sometimes actually it's quite easy to see through these narratives as they are told here, but you need instruments to be able to recognize how these narratives are made very, and to recognize that very quickly. I think a lot of people are too slow in recognizing what's happening there.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that resonates with the next question I want to ask. Though I want to pick up on something that you said earlier, Kirsten, about scientists both being demonized, but sometimes being elevated almost to a priesthood, which is an interesting one in itself, because some of the ways that we teach science, especially at an introductory level, almost elevate individual scientists to a priesthood. It's this scientist did this, and then this scientist did this, and then this scientist did this, which loses a lot of the dialogue and messiness of the process, but also in other ways the rigor of the process, if you want to think about it that way, because it is the emergence of consensus out of that messiness that becomes convincing. But even Fauci has two roles in a sense. He's a scientist and functions as a scientist in that community where there is a critical dialogue going on. But in his position at CDC, he is, in a sense, elevated to a priesthood. And in that sense, for political action, policy action in the US, it is his job to represent science. So in that sense, one could say, yes, he does represent scientists because that's his job. But I want to pick up on what you just said there, is one of the ways that these debates, or lack of debates, really play out in popular media and popular culture, is often like the image of Mr. Trump, who is standing up there at his own podium saying some things with attention paid to it, but without any of that dialogue that would go on, for example, at a professional meeting where somebody's giving a talk, if there's questions and shouting and disagreement and what have you. But even scientists portraying science in the media, we talk about what's called soundbite science, where very short papers are published in something like Nature, and then there's a press release about it, and there's a little bit of background often, but it's often an individual group of scientists who have their moment in the spotlight, so to speak, with their point of view being presented, and it also lacks that interactive dialogue with other members of the field. But I'm curious what you think, both of you, but especially Kirsten, coming with some background in theater. One of the strengths of many of the humanities is conveying very complex ideas in a way that's consumable by anyone, usually. Whereas science is often thought to be very complex and it needs to be presented very simply. And often that simplification feeds into the rhetoric that we're talking about here. Do you have thoughts of how scientists might communicate better?
This is a question actually for a communication specialist, and that's not who we are. But I think narrative is important here. I think, and that's why I mentioned this this group that I'm working for right now. I think all of our PhD students right now, they work on narratives that are linked to environment, but they talk about climate change and biodiversity and all of these things, but they do so from very different viewpoints. They read poetry, they look at art and so on. And I think that actually I see this as a part of science communication in a way, because it actually does not talk directly about climate change, for example, but it talks about, maybe the beauty of our landscapes, the joy of, experiencing biodiversity, or the danger of it, how interesting it is, the fascination of it, and all of these things. They become more visible, more emotionally traceable. in art, in literature, and so on. And I think this is something that really helps make people more kind of open to these very complicated topics that we have to deal with. I mean, we now see this explosion actually of popular books about forests, about mushrooms, about, all kinds of things that 30 years or 20 years ago would not have sold well. But these are people who actually are very well or very knowledgeable about these things, who partly come from the natural sciences, but who also know how to tell a story. And they know about genre, they know about emotions, they know how to, kind of write a fascinating and interesting story that turns, the climate into an event in a way. And this sounds cheap somehow, but they help us as kind of readers, of consumers of this type of literature to re-experience the world, to become more aware of, that a landscape is not just a landscape, that it is something that can be experienced in many different ways through our senses. And I think, this is something that the humanities can indirectly influence. And actually that is, I think, one of my core messages. I don't see us as communication specialists in the way of, becoming these PR people who tell the natural scientists what to do. But I think we can help our students to become better authors of books and films and all kinds of communication measures that can change the way the population looks at these complicated developments, that also ask people to change their habits after all. I mean, this is we will not be able to just continue the way we do, but this is not necessarily a threat.
I would,
and to tell stories about change and adaptation and coping and so on. I think that is something that the humanities can help further.
So I would, my first point would be, there are science communicators who can convey these things and do that very well. The Union of Concerned Scientists, for instance, offers workshops that do exactly that, to teach scientists or the interested public even how to tell stories about science that make sense, that are accurate, and that get all the essential details across. And there are, and I want to second that, there are excellent science writers out there that they do a terrific job of communicating things. And one of the beneficial effects, and you hesitate to say that about the pandemic, is that even more have come out of the woodwork. But, just to throw out some names, David Quammen, for example, who did write about a spillover effects in, I think it was 2012, his book Spillover, which is scientifically deeply researched, tells a great story also about scientists, and is actually something that you can teach in a class, even in a humanities class, precisely because it has so many interesting things to tell even humanities students about how to build a narrative. Jonathan Myberg was written an amazing book about the caracara, a bird that is almost extinct, that came out last year. Deborah Kramer, there are just plenty of names that you can put out there. Interestingly, not always scientists. Some of these are from a humanities background. Deborah Kramer, who's written the biography of the Atlantic Ocean, was an English major, as far as I know. Which brings me to my other point. It's not like the humanities are always clear and speak clearly to broader audiences. There's plenty of dense discourse that we are guilty of, and that we've been involved in. In fact, the history of literary criticism has been a struggle to establish our own seriousness and professionalism. And sometimes it has led to, unnecessarily arcane language, ways in which we, try to kind of impress our own respectability on audiences outside our field by being incomprehensible. What I would say that the humanities need to do, because that is the challenge we are facing right now, is to become, as Kristen said in her initial remarks, to really make interdisciplinarity one of the primary goals, to not shut ourselves off from what the sciences are doing, but to seek communication with scientists, with people in other fields, to do team teaching, for example, to learn from scientists, to see how they approach things, and then refine our own methods. As I mentioned at the beginning, I learned a great deal from Michael Hamburger, the seismologist I taught with, who has different approaches to material that might even be literary. We picked some novels for our class. Voltaire's Candide is an example, which covers the earthquake in Lisbon. And he had a very interesting perspective on it, something I would not have focused on. So it's a mutually enriching dialogue that also leads to both of us trying to refine the ways we speak to our students. So that is sort of a co-learning of how to communicate about things of shared importance to the world, which is something the humanities need to confront as well. And I myself have always, and I recognize how important this is to some people, when I see humanists sort of evoking the prospect of a post-human world, while real humans are struggling in this world. I always want to say, like, wait a minute, let's focus on what's going on right now. So it's a dialogue that we need to participate in. It's not like I would agree with Kristen, where we have a package that we can make available to scientists and all of a sudden they make more sense to the public. It's really a process where we need to come together in a shared endeavor.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, in some ways, my thought in asking that question was not about a clear package of message, but actually getting across complex things. And those are really interesting responses. It might be worth adding that we've experimented here at Indiana University with an institute that's similar to the one that Kristen is affiliated with. That started with a so-called Grand Challenge project called the Prepared for Environmental Change, and now has evolved into the Resilience Institute. That was, it embodied some of these thoughts. One, that it was very much cross-disciplinary and had humanities, science, et cetera. And in fact, in addition to scientific research, has produced art exhibits, for example, that are related to climate and environmental change, but was also intended to focus on the local things that people in Indiana, problems in Indiana, that I think also helped to resonate and get some of those feelings that you were talking about of really being emotionally engaged. And I think it's still too early to tell how successful it is for the broader community in Indiana, but it's certainly been really valuable for me as a scientist to interact with people through that. There are a bunch of questions coming in from the audience now, so maybe we'll turn to some of those. And I'll just ask them, and Christoph and Kirsten, you can answer as you please. The first one is, why do you believe that interdisciplinary approach would help? Given the assumption that the heart of science denial is ideological and maybe even political, it seems the main question is one of ideological power struggles and not necessarily one of struggles about what is actually fact or lie. What are your thoughts about that?
Let me just try to formulate some thoughts about that. I agree, but my take is actually not on, that we as scholars should waste all our time and energy, arguing with science denialists. It's also, to some extent, it won't lead anywhere, because also from a literary studies viewpoint, the narrative strategies they use are very boring, very traditional. They're easy to detect. It's not actually interesting. I mean, you can read it on Wikipedia. What are they doing? It's not, that's not the point. But the point is they are triggering emotions. And I think that in order to fight science denial or this so-called science skepticism, I think it's a good idea to add more stories to science and make the field less hermetic than it seems to be for a lot of people. I think for a lot of people, it seems they like the prototypical ivory tower debate. They don't understand what's going on there. It's all numbers, it's abstract, it's an elite that has these discussions. And I think that interdisciplinary work can enrich these seemingly abstract debates by adding history and histories and, look at things from perspectives that interest people, local perspectives, as you just mentioned, or maybe, the perspective of one family, something like a personal perspective, but also you can look at things from a gender perspective. You can look at things from an economical perspective. You can, there are all these different ways of, I'm not dissolving these scientific discourses, but to enrich them and to make them more graspable, maybe by doing this, and to kind of open the focus on this dichotomous type of discourse that I find is the main problem. If we stare on this on these fights between science and pseudoscience, I don't think there's much to win. Of course, we have to analyze it, but I think, where do we invest our energies? And I think there are many more interesting fields that are linked to science, but that are not immediately responding to science denial.
Yeah, I would agree. You have to some extent recognize that a lot of this is just bullshit, and to waste time on this is annoying. You might still remember Steve Bannon's famous statement that the purpose was, and he was saying this about the media, the purpose, or what one really should do, is to flood the zone with, and pardon my French, flood the zone with shit, and to really produce never-ending bullshit. And analyzing it is exhausting. It as Carson has said, it doesn't lead to much in the end. Not calling it out, though, is not a viable alternative either. So you need to be careful, sort of maintain a balance. Talking about interdisciplinarity, as I was trying to indicate earlier, it's not really about sharing facts, even though that's interesting. It is about getting to know different kinds of knowledge production, and the way science produces knowledge, the way the humanities produce knowledge. And that's something that the students benefit from seeing these different approaches. And this type of knowledge production, or getting to know how knowledge works in different fields, will benefit the humanities. It will also benefit science. As Carson pointed out in A Silent Spring, the problem comes partly from keeping science away from the public, from putting it in sort of a kind of silo, a space that sets it apart, something we don't know anything about. The purpose of interdisciplinarity is to establish dialogue. Of course, the facts are not unimportant. In coming back to Kunin's book, as a humanist, I can point out some of the language games that they are playing. I benefit from a scientist like my colleague Tim Londigan pointing out how cherry picking works and what he's actually doing when he says, there's ambiguity, there's uncertainty, and so forth. And learning how disaggregating facts from each other creates confusion, creates uncertainty, creates ambiguity where there isn't really ambiguity. You produce it by doing this. That's a very beneficial thing to find out too. And that's something that interdisciplinarity or an interdisciplinary dialogue makes possible for me.
is an excellent segue into the next question from the audience. And I'd add that the questions from the audience are very welcome. The next one is, might one of the reasons for science denial lie in the way that we have constructed knowledge production in the hard sciences, a construction that suggests that there is no or not much epistemological doubt in the hard sciences? I'm not suggesting that sciences themselves don't reflect critically upon their epistemological basis, but it's not communicated as such.
Yeah, I think that would reinforce a point that I was trying to make earlier about the misunderstanding what consensus in fact is, which is partly also the fault that of the media to some extent, perpetuating the narrative that science is about arriving at a fixed truth, and that's where we are, which is not how science works. Science is, or consensus in the sciences, is a majority agreement, really. This is subject to further investigation. And consensus, as we popularly understand it, means, okay, we've arrived at a point at which there's nothing more to do. And that is a fundamental misunderstanding that needs to be corrected. It's not something that the humanities can do. It's not something that the scientists can do, but it's certainly something that people who write about science for the public should do. And there are resources for journalists out there. In fact, we just published a little item in the newsletter that the news bulletin that I release every week that's precisely about this particular point, where there are resources for journalists, links that are being made available to teach them about how science in fact works.
Carson, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually trailed off a little bit thinking about, I mean, what we talk about here is, or a lot of this remains in this kind of educational, maybe elitist world. And when we talk about, the people and how to educate the people, there is this, there's this hierarchy in it. And I think that is something that's also happening in the media, because, and I totally agree with Christoph, that the media actually is constructing the scientist, the natural scientist, as sort of a knowing figure. They are expected to present numbers. Numbers are much shorter. Invite a humanist, or a philosopher or so, and then the moderator is going to complain very quickly. Can you put this really short and tell us in a nutshell what the result is? And the natural scientist can do that, or seems to be able to do that. They show statistics, numbers, and so on. And I think it actually has to do with this format. They only have half an hour. And it's easier for them to ask a natural scientist about climate change than to talk with a historian about the history of climate change debates, for example. That does happen as well, but it happens in totally different formats, longer formats, nighttime formats, and so on. So I think it also has to do with the structure of the media. And I mean, talking from a German perspective, I also see big differences then between American media and German media, of course, because I think in the United States, it is even more difficult to establish, programs like 8:00 p.m. Programs that discuss these types of things than in German public television, which actually was something that was introduced by the Allied forces in order to establish democracy after World War II in Germany. To establish a media or media that are there to not only entertain, but also to educate the public.
Perhaps to add something to it, inspired by your remark earlier, David, about the way we teach science, kind of hung up on scientists and what they represent, emphasizing as emphatically as we can that scientific consensus is a collective position. of many scientists taken in a field, in a given field, is such an important paradigm change that we really, really need to engage in. And added into this, what Carson was recommended 60 years ago, this is something that no one is exempt from. The scientists might be collectively engaged in this, but Carson is emphasizing that if we leave things to the specialists, if we are not science literate, if we don't take an interest in the science and what scientists do, this gets away from us, leading to situations where we let the specialists, as she calls them, take care of the world. And we kind of absent ourselves from that process. So moving away from the kind of heroic figure kind of paradigm towards understanding this as a group effort is so important. It's something that, you know, humanities or literary history can benefit from too, because the way we teach literary history still, for the most part, is sort of as a parade of like the greats who had this fantastic impact, and everything is associated with this erratic kind of halo that surrounds you know, these heroic figures. So this is work that we have to do, and this is something that also has a certain appeal to the public if we convince them that this is something that that will hold the key to the future. Sort of a collective of truth seekers, really, that no one can totally sort of abscond from.
Yeah, one of the things I was thinking earlier about science communication is that while there's many kinds of advice that are given to scientists about communicating, the most common form in my experience is to try to remove all the ambiguity from the narrative that's being presented to the public, to make it simple and to make it concrete, which feeds into the what the question from the audience asked about. And when I give presentations, I think as a paleontologist, I almost am a historian, but the way I often like to describe things is my own path of thought of how I became convinced about something, which does take a little bit of that history and the dialogue and the ambiguity and why did I finally become convinced that such and such was correct, for example. The next question from the audience, how far do theories that deconstruct ideas of universal reason or rationality and such of the just a second, let me start again. How far do theories that deconstruct ideas of universal reason or rationality and such of the possibility of universal knowledge and aid in opening up space? Sorry, I'm butchering this question. How far do theories that deconstruct ideas of universal reason or rationality aid in opening up a space for science denial and its social and political embodiment? Donald Trump.
Again, I mean, this is hard to say because we cannot say how it would be otherwise because this is the state of things. And I'm thinking about this quite a bit because I come from this generation of humanities scholars who were influenced by post-structuralism and postmodernism and so on. And we came up with this, you know, we want to end the grand narratives, the death of the author. We want to replace the grand narrative through all, you know, a multiplicity of narratives. There is no truth, there are only truths, and plurality instead of, you know, the single authority voice and so on. So this was, you know, these were ideas that were also fed by feminists, by ethnic minorities and so on. And, you know, I was absolutely part of this and I still am. But I again see that the way this has traveled into kind of popular knowledge, into the media, into public debates, is a simplification of these debates. It's a de-intellectualization of these debates. If you look at gender studies and the way these are debated now, it's a total simplification of of the complexity of this field. And but it is also a very intellectual debate that is going on there. And again, this is the question then of how do the humanities communicate their science, their knowledge. And that is, I think there are some weaknesses here as well. So I think, maybe the humanities have also contributed to the situation, but I don't think it's necessarily the humanities as university institutions, but it's the way they have been taken up again by multipliers, by the media.
I think the way I would answer the question is that it is important to recognize when under the surface of rationality, something else makes itself known. I'm thinking of something that greatly impressed me when I read it many, many years ago, Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism, in which she points out that one of the most effective techniques of totalitarian systems is to mask what they are doing as perfectly rational, as perfectly cogent, that's the word she uses, as perfectly logical. But underneath, something else has happened. And I do think that we do need to be aware of what I've described as one of the techniques of science denialism, to mask itself as reasonable, of taking advantage of that language, but for a purpose that is essentially, as I would describe it, totalitarian, because the point is to shut down debate, to silence people, with which the denialists move themselves out of that system of universal reasonability, rationality, and so forth. And to recognize the point at which this is happening is, I think, a task that observers in the humanities, for instance, would have, in which many of them have done during Trumpism and after. The question is how effective it has been.
That's an interesting question for me as a scientist, too. Michel Foucault, of course, is somebody who is very much demonized in certain areas for deconstruction in exactly the way that's portrayed here of deconstructing reason or rationality. And interestingly, as a scientist, when I first came to Foucault, which in some ways is embarrassingly late, but my first impression, particularly of archaeology of knowledge, was here's somebody who thinks like a scientist. Because that act of questioning the basis on which I think I know things, and questioning it and dissecting it and questioning it again, and then asking how is it built and what do I think of it and do I agree with it, I felt a lot of parallels as a scientist to that. Next question, and we're going to run out of time here pretty soon. Looking at different examples that have been mentioned so far, it seems that science denial has multiple roots. People afraid of technological innovation, people afraid of losing out on profitable technology. Is the resulting science denial actually the same, or does it differ substantially between people with different motivations for it?
Could you repeat the last part of what you said?
Well, I think the heart of it draws a dichotomy between people who are afraid of technological innovation. So perhaps let's take anti-vaccination as that, versus people afraid of losing out on profitable technology, which may be the tobacco or perhaps the climate change denial would be examples of. Is the resulting science denial actually the same, or does it differ substantially between those two motivations?
I would say there are different motivations, and of course, to some extent, it's a chicken or the egg kind of question. But to me, really, and I would fall on Naomi Oreskes in this, is the science denial that has a corporately sponsored source that overwhelms everything else, of which other types of denial might be the consequence. There's nothing more fundamental than the organized, well-financed, well-sponsored science denial that was done and is being done for profit. What Carson calls the right to make a dollar at every cost. That has suppressed scientific information, that has then spawned, as I would see it, other types of denial or fed into pre-existing attitudes. The fear of technology, for instance, as was mentioned in the question. But I would essentially sort of construct a hierarchy. And I feel that the science denial of the first order, the one that is sponsored on a large scale, is the real and the insistent problem. It's what we've seen recently, the influence of the industry on decisions that are being made. We've seen policy measures, much needed policy measures that would have addressed climate change for the first time in an organized fashion, being stymied by naked corporate interests that influence the vote of one particular important member, a politician. So I would say there are differences. It's not all the same, but I would think one supersedes others.
And Kirsten, what about the narratives that come out of them? So imagine me in small town Indiana, where people are trying to convince me, because all of these are messages where they're trying to convince somebody. Do I hear messages from those two as different narratives, or do they sound the same to me?
It really depends on the context. I think there has been debate. In Germany, there's several areas where COVID denial is particularly strong. One of them is Bavaria, where where I am now, and southern Germany in general, which is a very well-off part of Germany, actually. So it's not people who feel necessarily economically left behind or so, but there is a deep distrust then of, or there is a certain kind of cultural influences are at work here as well, kind of esoteric thinking, an idealization of nature that goes against, vaccines and so on. So I would say it's kind of a partly a privileged approach. You have other areas, other regions in Germany that are not well off, where, especially in the former GDR, where people are bitter, where they're disappointed about what happened after reunification. They lost their jobs. They hear all kinds of things from elites that are mostly West German. And there is a general distrust that has been growing for a long time. And the COVID denial in this case is also linked to this disappointment with a general distrust of elites and so on. So I think these are different narratives, and that's why I'm saying it really depends on where you are. If you are in a little small town Indiana environment, if it's it's not well off economically, if it has gone through a longer phase of disappointment, I think the story is a different one from the one that I hear from people in my immediate surroundings, actually, as well. I have not close friends, but I know quite a few people here who don't believe in COVID. And they, the same people who are very engaged in, nature preservation initiatives, who are, who engage in peace initiatives, help refugees, and all these things.
I think it's also important. Just one point that I wanted to add is not to demonize or diminish certain parts of the population as being automatically science illiterate. What we've seen in communities affected by contamination, for example, whether it's Flint or New England communities affected by the forever chemicals, we've seen parts of the population become very science literate and speak up for themselves, to the surprise often of the lawyers they had to deal with, to collaborate with scientists from the NRDC, for example, and participate in collective action against what was being done to them. So to me, that's a very, very important thing to remember as well, that there is this potential for science to activate communities, or communities to activate science, the other way around too. Might happen only in pockets. Detroit is another example where we've seen this kind of community activism. So there are these pockets of collaboration as well. So very important to remember as we think about that.
Yes, excellent point. We're effectively at the end of our formal time, but I was told that we could go over just a little bit, and I think I'll take that privilege, because the last question here really comes right back to the theme of this evening's event. The listener asked, one of the major public misconceptions of science seems to be the expectation of binary responses to all questions. The newspaper article where they talk to scientists on one side and somebody on the opposing side. Could the scientific community learn from the humanities to better communicate ambiguities and different shades of gray in responses to the global questions we have?
I would say yes. I mean, that kind of is a beautiful summary. I would turn the question into a statement. Yes, it should. That would be my response to it. But I would not describe it as a one-way street. I would, as I said before, humanists can learn from the scientists as well. Ambiguity can often be an excuse for being imprecise, or taking recourse to, well, we can't say for sure, or something like that. There are ways in which our thinking can be refined and gotten to a point where it makes more sense, is more transparent, and so forth. Truth with a capital T is something that no one is really after. But to understand the humanities and science as different approaches towards dealing and presenting multiple truths in ways that remain responsible to the facts as we know them at a given point in time, I think that should be the goal of our work.
Yeah, I agree. I also think that, we've been trained for many decades to prefer stories with a closure, formula fiction, to these complicated open-ended stories as readers. I'm not talking about being a literary studies person, as readers, as ordinary readers. And I think one needs to train how to enjoy different types of narrative. And that is something that is not easily done. This is something that takes time. But the promise is, there is this possibility. The human mind is capable of actually enjoying different types of knowledge acquisition that are more open, and I totally agree, ambiguity can be deadly. But open, multifaceted, heterogeneous, to be more tolerant of that. I think this would be helpful. Also in order to cope with the changes that lie ahead and that we need to cope with and that we have to find solutions for. There is not to be clear about that. There won't be that one solution, the one path. There will be many, and we don't know what the outcome is going to be.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both for this fascinating conversation. I wish we had another hour or two, because there's all sorts of threads that we could have picked up on. But I really appreciate your insights, and thank you to the host who brought us all together for this, and thank everyone in the audience for participating.
Thank you, David.
Thank you very much. Also, thank you for the questions.
Yes. Great fun.
Good evening, everyone.